Snow had a way of swallowing sound in high timber. On winter nights, the whole town felt wrapped in a white hush, as though the world were holding its breath. Officer Mason Rowe knew those nights well, the kind where the wind cut sideways, and the pines swayed like old men whispering secrets. His patrol was usually quiet during storms, and with his partner, a white German shepherd named Valor, he spent most of the shift clearing roads or checking on elderly residents who refused to leave their cabins for warmer shelters. But that night would be different. That night began with a knock on a cruiser window, so frantic it rattled the glass. Mason turned, startled, and saw a small figure stumbling through the snow. An 8-year-old boy, coat unzipped, boots mismatched, face red from cold and streaked with tears. Valor immediately sat forward, ears straight, sensing distress. Mason flung open the door.
Hey, son, what happened?
Are you hurt? The boy shook his head violently. No, not me. Please help.
They're hurting my grandpa!
The desperation in that tiny voice hit Mason harder than any winter wind. The boy was trembling so badly. Mason scooped him up and carried him into the back seat of the cruiser, while Valor nuzzled his shoulder reassuringly. What's your name? Mason asked. Evan. The boy gulped a breath. Please hurry. Grandpa James, they tied him to a tree in the woods. They said they'd freeze him if he didn't sign the papers. Mason felt his stomach tighten. Timberland disputes weren't rare in high timber. Big companies occasionally tried forcing old landowners into selling. But violence? This was beyond anything he'd heard. Where is he? Mason asked. Evan pointed with a shaking hand toward the thick forest bordering the old logging road. I ran as fast as I could. I didn't know who else to find. Valor's anxious whining filled the cruiser, pushing Mason into motion. He hit the emergency lights, radioed dispatch with only the basics, and accelerated toward the trail entrance. Evan, you did the right thing running for help, Mason said, glancing in the rearview mirror. We're going to get your grandfather. The boy nodded, tears dripping silently. As Mason drove, he kept one hand on the wheel, and one hand absent-mindedly scratching Valor's neck. The dog was trained to detect distress, and right now he was restless, head low, muscles tight, sensing urgency. When they reached the forest gate, Mason parked, grabbed his flashlight, and commanded, Valor, track. The shepherd leaped into the snow, lowered his nose, and surged into the trees. Mason lifted Evan onto his hip and followed the dog, boots sinking deep into the drifts. The deeper they moved into the woods, the colder it felt, like the temperature dropped with every step. Evan clung to Mason's coat, guiding him with soft whispers. There, that way, I think. Valor suddenly barked sharply and took off between two massive pines. Mason hurried after him, then skidded to a stop. There, half hidden among the trees, was a man tied to a trunk with rough rope. Snow coated his shoulders and beard. His face was badly bruised, one eye swollen shut. He wasn't moving. Grandpa! Evan screamed. Mason knelt, checked for a pulse. Relief washed through him when he found it, faint but steady. He's alive, he said quickly. He's alive, Evan. Take a breath. Valor stood guard, tail stiff, eyes fixed on the dark woods, as if expecting danger to reappear. Mason cut the ropes carefully, eased the older man, James Whitaker, a local Korean War veteran, onto the snow. James groaned faintly. Evan, boy, that you? I'm here, Grandpa, Evan sobbed. I found help. Mason wrapped his patrol jacket around James's shoulders. Hang tight, sir. We've got you. But before he could radio for paramedics, Valor growled, a deep warning rumble that vibrated through the trees. Mason's breath fogged in front of him. What is it, boy? The shepherd lunged forward, barking furiously. Branches snapped somewhere ahead, then footsteps, fast and stumbling, retreated deeper into the forest. They're still close, Mason said. Whoever did this didn't expect him to last long. James coughed weakly. 3 of them wanted my land. Said I'd sell or freeze. Mason's jaw tightened. A veteran abandoned to die in the snow for a patch of timberland. He felt a cold anger stirring. He radioed backup, voice low but steady. I need immediate assistance at Pine Ridge Forest. 1 injured civilian. Possible suspects nearby. Evan knelt beside his grandfather, clutching his hand. Grandpa, I'm sorry I left you. "You saved me, boy," James whispered. "Your grandma's watching from heaven. She guided your steps." Something in Mason's chest tightened. Snow fell heavier now, swirling around them like tiny pieces of glass. Valor kept barking into the darkness, then circling back protectively. "We need to move," Mason said. "Storm's getting worse." He lifted James with effort, older but solid, and steadied him. Evan walked closely, one hand on Mason's arm, the other on Valor's back for balance. As they trudged toward the road, Mason felt the weight of more than just a rescue unfolding. Something deeper lingered in the air, an unsettling sense that this attack wasn't an isolated act of greed, but a symptom of something rotten beneath the surface of their quiet town. And whatever it was, he had just stepped into the middle of it. The storm thickened through the night, turning the pines into white silhouettes and filling every gap in the old logging road with fresh drifts. By the time Thomas and the young boy reached the ridge, the wind had settled into a steady howl, the kind that carried memories of winters long gone. The dog, Ruger, kept close to the boy's side, his warm breath curling into the frosty air with each step. Thomas didn't let himself slow. He knew the weather wouldn't wait for anyone. They reached the abandoned ranger cabin just as another curtain of snow swept over the ridge. Its roof sagged under decades of neglect, its windows shuttered with warped planks. But it was shelter, and in that moment, it might as well have been a mansion. The boy's knees buckled the second Thomas nudged open the door. Inside, the cabin smelled of old pine and cold stone. Dust coated everything, but the fireplace sat intact beneath a heavy mantle. Thomas set the boy gently near it, too aware of how pale the child's face had become. The boy's boots were soaked through, his hands trembling violently, even though Ruger had pressed himself against him, offering warmth the way only a loyal dog could. Thomas struck a match. The tiny flame wavered, struggled, then caught the edge of the kindling he'd scavenged outside. Within minutes, the small fire grew strong enough to chase the shadows away from the room. The boy leaned toward it instinctively. "You're safe now," Thomas said softly. His voice carried the steadiness of a man who had seen many winters, some cruel, some beautiful, all shaping him into who he was. "What's your name, son?" The boy swallowed hard. "Andrew." "Andrew?" Thomas repeated, then waited. He'd learned long ago that frightened children needed space, to let their story come out in its own time. Ruger did the work for them both. He rested his chin on Andrew's knee, earning the faintest smile, weak but unmistakably grateful. Thomas knew then that the boy had been alone for too long out in the storm. When Andrew finally spoke, the words trembled more than his hands. I didn't mean to get lost. My dad told me to stay in the truck, but I went out to look for him when he didn't come back. And then the snow, I couldn't find anything." Thomas felt something tighten inside him. It was the tone, the raw mixture of fear and guilt that struck straight into his chest. "Your father," he said carefully. "Where did you last see him?" "Down by the creek," Andrew whispered. "He said the truck slid into the ditch. He went to check if the wheels were stuck." The boy's voice cracked. "That was hours ago." Thomas sat back, his mind working through the pieces. The storm would have worsened conditions quickly. If the father had tried to walk for help or slipped near the frozen water, time was running dangerously short. "Listen to me," Thomas said, leaning closer. "You did the right thing by holding on. You found warmth. You found help. And now, Andrew, we'll find your dad too." Ruger lifted his head at the word find, ears pricking. Even in the flickering firelight, Thomas could read the dog easily. A working spirit never fully dimmed, instincts sharp as ever. But outside, the wind roared against the cabin walls. It was the kind of storm that swallowed sound and distance, the kind that reshaped the whole landscape in just a few hours. "You'll go out there?" Andrew asked, eyes wide with a mixture of hope and dread. Thomas breathed slowly. He was 71, long retired, and his joints didn't tolerate the cold like they used to. But the thought of leaving someone out there, alone in the dark, buried under the punishing snow, cut deep into memories he wished he'd left behind. People he hadn't reached in time, faces he could still see when nights grew quiet. "Yes," he said finally. "I'll go." Ruger nudged his leg as if to say we. But before leaving the boy alone, Thomas layered blankets around him, propped the cabin door with a log to keep the wind from ripping it open, and placed another piece of wood on the fire. Andrew rested against Ruger's side, comforted by the steady heartbeat and gentle warmth. Thomas paused at the threshold. The night was a wall of white, swirling, shifting, swallowing the world beyond a few feet. He had survived storms like this before, back when he was part of the mountain search unit, but never at his age, never without backup. Still, the boy's small, hopeful face burned in his mind. "Stay with him," Thomas whispered to Ruger. But the dog whined, refusing to stay behind. He planted himself beside the door, muscles taut, tail stiff with purpose. Thomas understood then that the dog felt the call just as strongly as he did. A life was out there, a father lost in the same storm that almost claimed his son. And no loyal dog would abandon a search like this. "All right," he sighed, "but you keep close." And together, the old man and the aging German shepherd stepped into the blinding snow. Each footstep swallowed as soon as it landed. The storm met them head-on, but they pressed forward anyway. Because somewhere in that endless expanse of white, a man was waiting for someone to find him. The darkness felt heavier the farther they moved from the cabin, and the wind kept shifting, carrying sharp bursts of powdered snow that stung Thomas's cheeks. Ruger moved ahead, stopping every few steps to glance back, making sure Thomas hadn't fallen behind. The old shepherd's coat was frosting over, but there was fire in his eyes, an awareness, a focus that only a dog with years of service could possess. Thomas pointed his flashlight toward the slope. The beam barely carved a pale tunnel through the storm. "Easy, boy," he muttered as Ruger tugged forward, nose close to the ground. "We'll find him." The creek wasn't far in summer, but winter had transformed the landscape, hiding familiar paths beneath thick drifts. Even in the flickering firelight, Thomas could read the dog easily. A working spirit never fully dimmed, instincts sharp as ever. But outside, the wind roared against the cabin walls. It was the kind of storm that swallowed sound and distance, the kind that reshaped the whole landscape in just a few hours. "You'll go out there?" Andrew asked, eyes wide with a mixture of hope and dread. Thomas breathed slowly. He was 71, long retired, and his joints didn't tolerate the cold like they used to. But the thought of leaving someone out there, alone in the dark, buried under the punishing snow, cut deep into memories he wished he'd left behind. People he hadn't reached in time, faces he could still see when nights grew quiet. "Yes," he said finally. "I'll go." Ruger nudged his leg as if to say we, but before leaving the boy alone, Thomas layered blankets around him, propped the cabin door with a log to keep the wind from ripping it open, and placed another piece of wood on the fire. Andrew rested against Ruger's side, comforted by the steady heartbeat and gentle warmth. Thomas paused at the threshold. The night was a wall of white, swirling, shifting, swallowing the world beyond a few feet. He had survived storms like this before, back when he was part of the mountain search unit, but never at his age, never without backup. Still, the boy's small, hopeful face burned in his mind. "Stay with him," Thomas whispered to Ruger. But the dog whined, refusing to stay behind. He planted himself beside the door, muscles taut, tail stiff with purpose. Thomas understood then that the dog felt the call just as strongly as he did. A life was out there, a father lost in the same storm that almost claimed his son. And no loyal dog would abandon a search like this. "All right," he sighed, "but you keep close." And together, the old man and the aging German shepherd stepped into the blinding snow. Each footstep swallowed as soon as it landed. The storm met them head-on, but they pressed forward anyway. Because somewhere in that endless expanse of white, a man was waiting for someone to find him. The darkness felt heavier the farther they moved from the cabin, and the wind kept shifting, carrying sharp bursts of powdered snow that stung Thomas's cheeks. Ruger moved ahead, stopping every few steps to glance back, making sure Thomas hadn't fallen behind. The old shepherd's coat was frosting over, but there was fire in his eyes, an awareness, a focus that only a dog with years of service could possess. Thomas pointed his flashlight toward the slope. The beam barely carved a pale tunnel through the storm. "Easy, boy," he muttered as Ruger tugged forward, nose close to the ground. We'll find him. The creek wasn't far in summer, but winter had transformed the landscape, hiding familiar paths beneath thick drifts. The snow muffled everything, each step a soft crunch swallowed instantly by the storm's roar. Thomas could feel the cold pressing into his joints, numbing his fingers even through his gloves. Age reminded him of its presence with every breath, every bend of his knees. But he pushed on, guided by the memory of hundreds of searches years ago, and by the determined shape of Ruger weaving ahead of him like a living compass. When they finally reached the tree line near the creek, Ruger stopped abruptly. His ears shot forward, tail rising. He let out a low growl, not of threat but alertness. Thomas steadied himself, lifting the light. Broken branches, a fresh slide in the snow. Tracks, but not the kind Thomas expected. Bare fingers had clawed into the drift, leaving desperate lines where someone had tried to pull themselves upward. The tracks led toward a cluster of old cedars leaning over the creek. "Good boy," Thomas whispered. His heart pounded. Ruger followed the trail with increasing urgency. Then Thomas saw it, something dark at the base of the trees, a shape half buried in snow. Oh no! He hurried as much as his stiff knees allowed and collapsed beside the figure. It was a man curled on his side, his jacket torn from catching on branches. His beard was frosted solid, his lips pale. One arm was twisted awkwardly underneath his weight. Thomas pressed 2 fingers to the man's neck. A moment passed, then faint but there, a pulse. "He's alive," Thomas said, more to himself than to Ruger. Relief washed over him like sudden heat. But the man was fading. Hypothermia was already deepening. They had to move fast. "Sir," Thomas said loudly, shaking his shoulder. "Can you hear me?" The man's eyelids fluttered, and he let out a shallow, raspy breath. Andrew?" "He's safe," Thomas said quickly. "I found him. He's waiting for you." Tears gathered in the man's eyes, tears that froze almost instantly on his lashes. But the spark of consciousness faded again, leaving him limp. Thomas looked around. The cabin was far, too far to carry him alone through the thickening storm, especially with the man's arm injured. He needed a plan, something practical, something he'd once taught younger search and rescue recruits decades earlier. Shelter first. Movement only when safe. The storm was worsening. Trying to drag the man through it now could kill them both. Thomas scanned the trees until he spotted a wide cedar, with a hollowed pocket of earth beneath its leaning trunk, protected from the wind by the thick boughs above. It wasn't perfect, but it could shield them long enough to stabilize the man. "Come on," he muttered. Hooking his arms under the injured man's shoulders, he dragged him gently but firmly toward the cedar, stopping every few feet to catch his breath. Ruger circled around them anxiously, whining whenever Thomas paused too long. Once under the tree, Thomas stripped off his outer coat and wrapped it around the man's torso, tightening it against the cold. Then he brushed as much snow as he could from the man's face and placed Ruger beside him. "Lie close, boy," Thomas instructed. "Keep his core warm." Ruger obeyed instantly, pressing his body along the man's side, generating heat only a loyal dog could offer in such a moment. Thomas worked quickly, checking the man's arm. A break, maybe a dislocation. Hard to tell without tools. He tore a strip from the inner lining of his own shirt and fashioned a crude sling, wrapping it carefully around the man's injured limb. The man stirred slightly, groaning, but didn't wake. "Stay with us," Thomas murmured. The storm rumbled overhead, shaking loose snow from the branches. The old cedar groaned, but its shelter held. Thomas let his breath slow. They had a buffer now, a chance. But the journey back still loomed. It would require timing, strength, and every ounce of determination left in him. Ruger shifted, ears twitching. He nudged the man's arm, then looked toward Thomas with a silent, urgent plea. "I know," Thomas said softly. "We're not done." Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Thomas kept checking the man's pulse, slow but present. His breathing remained shallow, but no longer weakening. When the wind finally softened, though still fierce, Thomas knew it was their moment. "Ruger." The dog lifted his head. "We're taking him home." Thomas maneuvered behind the man, braced his legs, and lifted. His body screamed in protest, hips aching, shoulders burning, but he forced himself upright. The world spun for a second, but he planted his feet until the dizziness passed. Easy, he whispered to himself. One step at a time. Ruger stayed close, guiding them, keeping pace, alert for hazards buried beneath the snow. Thomas leaned into the dog's presence, drawing courage from that unwavering loyalty. Each step felt heavier than the last. Snow clung to Thomas's boots, weighing him down. His breath came in harsh clouds, but he never loosened his grip on the unconscious man. A few times he stumbled, falling to his knees, the weight of the man pulling him sideways. Each time Ruger barked sharply. Encouragement, warning, insistence. And Thomas pushed back onto his feet. He refused to let the man die. Not after coming this far. Not after seeing the hope return to Andrew's eyes by the fireplace. Finally, through the thinning storm, the outline of the cabin appeared. Dim, distant, but unmistakable. "We made it," Thomas whispered, voice trembling. But the hardest part, getting inside, was yet to come. Ruger ran ahead, barking loudly, announcing their approach. The moment Thomas reached the cabin door, it swung open from the inside. Andrew stood there, face glowing from firelight, eyes widening when he saw his father slumped in Thomas's arms. "Dad!" His cry cut through the cold, sharp and heartbreaking. "Move back," Thomas said gently. "Help me clear the floor." Andrew rushed inside, pushing blankets aside, creating space near the fire. When Thomas lowered the man onto the wooden planks, Andrew fell at his side, holding his father's hand with trembling fingers.
Is he?
"He's alive," Thomas said, kneeling beside them. "But he needs warmth, and he needs it now." Ruger lay down beside the injured man again, pressing close, as if resuming the duty he'd started under the cedar. The fire crackled, casting warm orange light across all of them. It felt like hope returning. For the first time since the storm began, Thomas allowed himself to breathe, not fully, not yet, but enough to know they had crossed the worst of it. The storm faded into a soft whisper against the cabin walls. Hours passed in a blur of tending, warming, and watching. Thomas brewed warm broth and spooned small amounts between the older man's lips. Andrew kept vigil at his father's side, rarely blinking, his small hands wrapped around the man's much larger, weathered one. At last, close to dawn, the man stirred. His eyes opened weakly, darting around as if unsure of where he was. When they finally settled on Andrew, a trembling smile formed. "Dad," Andrew whispered, tears streaming freely now. The man swallowed with difficulty. "Thought I wouldn't see you again." "You're safe," Andrew said quickly. "Mr. Turner found me, and Ruger. They found you." The older man turned his head toward Thomas and the dog. His voice cracked. "Thank you." Thomas shook his head gently. "Your boy led us to you. He's the real hero." Andrew's face flushed, but he stayed close, leaning his cheek against his father's arm. As the injured man regained coherence, Thomas asked the question that had weighed on him since the night before. "Who did this to you?" The man winced. "3 men. Said they were from the county, claiming something about overdue taxes. But they weren't. They tried to force me to sign over the land." He coughed, pain rippling through him. "When I refused, they beat me, dragged me into the trees, left me." Thomas felt a coldness that had nothing to do with winter settle into his chest. "Did you see their faces?" The man nodded slowly. "One of them. The tall one. Beard, scar on his cheek." Andrew jerked upright. "That's the man who scared me when I was getting firewood last summer." The pieces clicked into place. This wasn't random. Someone wanted this land badly enough to leave a man to die in a blizzard. Thomas stood, joints cracking in protest. "I'm getting help." But he didn't need to. The distant crunch of heavy tires echoed down the snow-packed trail. Headlights glowed between the pines. Within moments, a familiar voice carried through the cold. "Thomas Turner, you in there?" Mason Rowe stepped into view, snow clinging to his uniform and beard. And beside him, white-coated K9 Titan shaking off powder with a snort. "Mason!" Thomas blinked. "What on earth?" The dispatcher flagged Andrew's emergency call as dropped. I tried calling back, no answer. And when the storm worsened, Mason exhaled in relief. "I came to check on you." Titan trotted inside, immediately sniffing Ruger, before settling respectfully beside him. The 2 dogs exchanged a quiet, wordless acknowledgement only working dogs understood. Mason's eyes landed on the injured man. "Good Lord, what happened?" Thomas relayed everything briefly. Mason's expression hardened. "I know who he's describing," Mason said. "We've been investigating a group pressuring elderly landowners near the state line. But this," he shook his head, "this is attempted murder." Mason leaned down, speaking gently to the older man. "Sir, we're getting you to the hospital. Titan will track the men. We'll catch them." The veteran's eyes filled with gratitude and exhaustion. "Thank you, officer." Within minutes, Mason radioed for backup and medical assistance. The cabin filled with warm commands, crackling static, and Titan's purposeful pacing as he prepared to lead the search. When the paramedics arrived, they carried the injured man out carefully and secured him in the heated ambulance. Andrew climbed into the back with him, clutching his hand tightly. Before they closed the doors, the man whispered something to Thomas. "You saved my life." Thomas touched his shoulder gently. "Just glad you're still here." Snow softened as the ambulance lights vanished down the trail. Mason approached Thomas with a steady hand on his shoulder. "You did more than most men half your age could have done tonight," Mason said. "I'm proud of you." Thomas glanced at Ruger, who sat calmly at his side, tail thumping lightly. "Couldn't have done it without him." Mason smiled. "Titan agrees." Titan barked once as if confirming the statement. As morning light spread slowly over the snow-covered hills, Mason prepared to follow Titan on the trail of the attackers. But before leaving, he turned to Thomas. "You're not alone out here, you know. The whole town should know what you did." Thomas waved the sentiment away. "Just helped a neighbor. That's what we're supposed to do." Mason studied him for a moment, then nodded with respect. "You did more than that. You restored hope on a night that tried its best to take it." With that, he called Titan to heel and headed into the quiet woods, ready to hunt down the men responsible. The cabin grew still again. Ruger leaned into Thomas, seeking warmth and offering it at the same time. Outside, a soft golden glow stretched across the snow, touching everything with the gentle promise of a new morning. Thomas closed the door, knelt beside his aging dog, and stroked the fur between his ears. "We made it through another one, old friend." Ruger lifted his nose, pressed it against Thomas's hand, and let out a soft, tired sigh, the kind that sounded like gratitude, the kind that sounded like home. And as the storm clouds broke apart, letting the first hopeful rays of sun spill across high timber, Thomas felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not just relief, not just pride, but a quiet certainty that even on the coldest nights, when fear screams, when evil tries to break the weak, when darkness swallows the path, there are still good people, loyal dogs, and small miracles waiting to rise. Sometimes in the form of a police officer and his white canine, sometimes in the form of a lost child calling for help, and sometimes simply in the form of an old dog and an older man refusing to give up. High timber would heal, justice would be served, a family would stay whole, and hope, stubborn, shining, unwavering, would walk beside them long after the snow melted.